Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Sound Decisions here on Passion for Sound. Just a reminder, Sound Decisions episodes are all about providing information and knowledge to you, the audience, to help you make good decisions when you're considering buying new audio gear, changing your current audio setup, or really just looking for better ways to enjoy your music. Just a reminder before I introduce this episode, the giveaway of the SMSL SP200 amplifier is still going on. All you need to do to be in the running to win that amplifier is be a subscriber and leave a comment down below about something you might like to see reviewed or a comment relevant to the topics discussed here with Dan and I today. As always, patrons get extra chances in the draw, so if you're interested in getting more chances to win the SMSL SP200 amplifier, jump down below, check out the link through to Patreon, and see if there's a tier there that suits your level of interest. For now though, let's get on with the interview. If you haven't already watched part 1, I do recommend you go back and start there, but just to refresh your memory, this episode is part 2 of an interview with Dan Schmolle, the director of Bottlehead Audio in the United States. In part 1, we talked a little bit about Dan's origins, how he came to start Bottlehead in the first place. We talked a little bit about things like tube harmonics and whether or not tubes are actually a good technology to be using for audio. And in this episode, Dan continues by talking about some of the challenges that we face when we're working with old technology that's no longer manufactured, in this case obviously tubes. So it's an interesting insight into the thought processes that Bottlehead have to go through, ensuring that the tubes that they're making their kits with are available for us end users to be able to enjoy the kits for a long, long time. There'll be at least one more part to this video, possibly 2 I expect, so do make sure you hit subscribe if you're enjoying this and you want to see more. But for now, let me get out of the way, hand over to Dan, as I've just asked him about whether or not it's the harmonics in tubes that lead to the extra level of weightiness that I hear, positive weightiness, that I hear when I listen to the mainline tube amplifier from Bottlehead. I've talked multiple times, one of the things I love the most about the mainline is the sense of body and not thickness or heaviness, but each note, I should say, has weight. Would that be coming from that, or is that something different again, do you think?
The weight, I think, has to do a lot with impedance matching, which is another whole thing to get into, and just also kind of that's a characteristic that varies from one tube to the next, and I think that there's actually structural issues in there and maybe even compositional issues in how the tubes are made that have some influence on that. There are definitely tubes that have a reputation. I keep bringing up the 300B just because it's kind of the king of tubes. 300B has a reputation for really being able to deliver that weight, that lower, the lower mid-range male vocal thing really comes through. Okay. It's kind of interesting that you bring it up in the main line. Actually, the 6C45 pi tube that's used in that is not a particularly weighty tube. It's actually one that kind of in the old community that goes way back to the early 90s, when all of us guys in the world kind of all knew each other. We used to kind of call that a whitish sounding tube. Right. And it had a little bit more upper frequency emphasis maybe than some of the other tubes, but it's still a tube. And they do have that warm body area in their performance.
And perhaps going back to the main line, that might be actually why I've found it so impressive next to solid state amps, is that it's got that high end emphasis from the 6C45 tube combined with the weight of tubes in general. Perhaps that's what the magic in that amplifier is, from what you've just been saying.
Yeah, I think so. One of the things we did in that amp is it has a couple of different output impedance settings, taps on the actually ways you can configure the output transformer secondary, and we call them low and high. I think they're actually 16 ohms and 64 ohms.
Okay.
And the 16 ohm setting works very nicely with the bulk of headphones being 32 ohms. That's a nice match. Typically you want, if you err one way or the other, you want your load to be a little higher than the output impedance of the device that's driving it. And that varies where you are in your gain chain through from preamps to sources to preamps or preamps to amps or amps to loudspeakers or headphones. And even still, even though generally the general idea is that the output impedance should exactly match the impedance of the driver you're listening to, it's not necessarily that bad to go up doubling like that, to go a 16 ohm output into a 32 ohm load. And again, a 64 ohm output into something like Sennheiser HD 650s or HD 800s turns out to be a really nice balancing point. In fact, if you go to something higher than that, which we do in our Crack OTL amp, it's got anywhere from 120 to a couple hundred ohms output impedance, depending on how it's configured. A lot of people still like it with the HD 650s and the HD 800s. In fact, a whole lot of people like it because we sell zillions of things. But when you listen back in comparison, the Crack is warm and a little fat, and it's got that real tubey character, and some people really love it. I think it's great. I'm glad they do. But it's partly because that output impedance of that amp is so much higher, so there's not quite that mismatch, if you will, that big differential between the output impedance of the amp and the input impedance of the headphones. And so what's happening with the main line is it's actually kind of tightening things up just a little bit and allowing some premium headphones like the Focals and the HD 800s, whatever it might be, to really show what they can do down at the bottom end, that they might not show as well with an amp that's not so well matched.
It's interesting you're talking about having the output impedance close to the load impedance, because in a lot of circles, and I've always been potentially guilty of this, I've always worked on the 8 times rule of the load should be 8 times in the headphone world, at least in the earphone world, that the load should be 8 times the output impedance of the device from a damping factor point of view, and to make up for the non-linearity of some of the load impedances. So from memory, a Tesla driver, the T1 from Beyerdynamic, has this, and I think actually the HD650 does this too, has this really interesting impedance curve within the driver at different frequencies. So from what you're saying, though, is that different because we're talking a different technology in terms of tubes, or is it just different philosophies?
There's a lot more going on than just those things, and I think it's not just impedance matching necessarily. That's one part of a lot of considerations to make, and certainly the 8 times or the 5 times rule or whatever whichever one you choose, and there's a lot. That's certainly done with phono cartridge matching to phono preamps and so on, and in tube amps, you tend to want to have a pretty high input impedance, so anything that's running into it, sounds the same, and so on. And I think that the issue potentially that's going on is when somebody designs a headphone, they may start with these rules and then only try them with that particular situation, right? So if the rule is that your output impedance of your amp needs to be 1/8 of whatever your headphones impedance is, that's what you design around. That's what you voice your headphones around. Okay. And it might be that there's something else out there that works better, but it may not have been tried. And again, these things are kind of speculative. I mean, everybody wants to be an expert, except me, maybe. I don't really like that. I feel a lot more like with this stuff that I'm clutching for ideas, and I'm the last guy to say that, this is my theory and this is absolutely why this is this way. But what I would say is I'm guilty of what I'm just mentioned, in that I like HD 600s, HD 650s, HD 800s a lot, and all of our headphone amps consequently are voiced with that in mind. So all of our headphone amps happen to work really well with those headphones. work as well with other headphones? Well, maybe I haven't tried as many, and I can't really tell you. And conversely, you run into guys who've, designed these headphones, and they've got this amp, and that's what they design all their headphones with. I know, I've talked to those guys. I mean, that happens a lot. There's more opportunities out there to find something kind of magical that might work.
Yeah.
When we did the mainline, we did have more headphones in mind, and we were aware of this impedance thing, and that's why it has that impedance switch in it. The big red thing I showed you has, I think, 4 or 5 different settings, and you can make yourself crazy throwing that switch around. I like the mid-range a little better here, but I like the bass a little better when I do that. But no, wait a minute, let me go back, and you never do come up with a decision.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. You can start with these rules that say 8 times or 5 times or exact match or whatever. The exact match thing, I think, really goes back to the old days in the recording industry and pro sound. Things were matched like that a lot. And I don't necessarily think it's the best. I have this old green Altec console. It has a 500 ohm standard line level output on it. I spent several years tracking down a very difficult to find pair of Sennheiser HD25-13s, which are the 600 ohm version of the HD25s. And I was thrilled because I found a 600 ohm headphone that was closed back so I could use it to monitor when I was recording with it. And it works fine, but it definitely has that characteristics that you would think of an exact impedance match. It's a little fat, but it's a little dull on the top, and it doesn't really let me hear what I need to hear when I'm recording. So that can, those things, those rules are a great place to start. But I think it's worth, trying some wacky stuff too, and just see what happens. And I tell everybody, try the switch both ways on the main line. Whatever it is that whatever headphones you're using, you can't break anything, and just give it a shot. You may find that it suits your taste. Maybe it compensates for a particular sonic character of your digital front end or your phono, your vinyl playback system, or whatever. Sometimes you can compensate for other things elsewhere in the system.
That's really interesting, because I just sitting here thinking about it, I religiously match the impedance switch to what I know is the impedance of the headphones. I just go low or high depending on the headphones, and I never take the time to explore. So I'm now, when I get off this call, going to sit here and start flipping switches and see. That's a great suggestion.
This probably goes back to my experience in the recording industry and dealing with recording engineers and mastering engineers who are the geekiest people in the world, but they also know that they're artists. And they also know that this is an art form, and it's not an engineering discipline in itself. We're not building airplanes. It's not going to fall out of the sky. And each of these guys does want to put his own part of himself into it, his own flavor on this thing that he does. So there is no absolute. And that's why I tell everybody, you got to really play around and try all this stuff, because not only does the guy who's producing this stuff to deliver to you have a certain way he wants it to sound, you have a certain way that you hear things. And you have a certain way that your brain wants to hear things. And everybody hears differently.
Absolutely.
So you need to play around with your system and not get too caught up in this set of rules that somebody's put out there about how impedances should be, or you need to have this voltage or this whatever, and just try stuff and just sit and listen and go, oh yeah, this one really seems to be working for me. And my old way of approaching this was to say it has to make me want to dance. If I want to get up out of my chair and dance, it's got to be sounding good.
Yeah, and that's exactly whenever I review any headphones, any earphones, if it's not making me bob my head, I'm not loving it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's interesting. I like it.
The ultimate test.
Exactly. If you're happy and it's giving you joy, then something's working well.
Right.
After I got off the call from Dan, I did actually go and plug the Focal Clears into the main line and played around with that impedance matching switch. And I have to say that the sound on high impedance to my ears was actually more enjoyable, which really surprised me. I'm used to the higher output impedance causing all sorts of problems like loose flabby bass, sometimes the treble getting too rolled off. But what I did find, similar to what Dan was talking about, was that with the Focal Clears, the sound actually got a little bit fuller in the bass, as to be expected, but also in the lower mid-range, and it brought a level of realism to the focal clears that they do sometimes lack just ever so slightly. So it was a really interesting experiment, and something I'm so glad Dan suggested is that we really think about listening for enjoyment, not listening to follow rules or technical specifications. I also tried the Metzer Empyreans. I'd heard before and I'd experienced before that planar magnetic headphones are less affected by impedance matching, and I'd have to say I heard zero difference when I flipped between the low impedance and high impedance output of the main line with the Empyreans. So really I just want to reinforce here what Dan's saying. Have a play, have an experiment with your gear, particularly if it does have different settings like this, whether it's filters on a DAC, whether it's impedance matching on an amplifier. Have a play and see what you like the best, rather than what someone somewhere has said from a technical specification is meant to be right. Because often, as Dan said, that's just a case of somebody has tuned it based on their preferences and based on the specifications that they are working with. It doesn't mean it's best for everybody. So I've really enjoyed having my eyes open to that one. I hope you'll find it helpful as well. Let's get back to the interview.
One of the concerns, and I catch myself with this sometimes, and I know it gets talked about with some people, do tubes wear out quickly, and therefore will people be always having to constantly find new, or obviously new old stock sometimes, but replacement tubes for their gear if they don't go down the path of tubes?
Well, the general answer is no. Tubes don't wear out that quickly. That said, there's a lot of different tubes that were designed for a lot of different purposes. Many that were not designed specifically for high-end audio use that have been pressed into service doing that.
Okay.
And there are also a lot of different ways to design a circuit in terms of how much current you run through it, how much stress the tube goes under when the amp starts, and how hard the tubes are worked in terms of being trapped in an environment where they can't keep their envelopes cool enough, structural kind of things, the way that things are laid out. So it's not just a yes or no question.
Yeah.
We really try to design our circuits to make the tubes last as long as possible. So generally speaking, we run them a lot easier than their maximum ratings, much, much easier. There are manufacturers, again, I'm not going to name any names, but there's well-known manufacturers who have reputations in the industry for just, burning up tubes, running a 12AX7 tube at 400 volts, which was never designed for. It was designed for 250 volts or 300 volts or something like that. Yeah. So we run things easy. A 300B tube can dissipate 40 watts. We tend to run ours at about 24 watts.
Okay.
A good operating point that puts out 8 watts of power, but it's not, it's burning up the tube. There are also certain tubes that, for one reason or other, have turned out for us to not have a great lifetime. There's a Russian tube, ex-Soviet tube, called the 6N1P, which is fairly similar. It's not the same as a 6922 or a 6DJ8. It's a nice sounding tube for about 3 months. Is what
Yeah, right.
And I speak from experience because I had mentioned that we built up some amps for Paul Stubblebine years ago for his mastering system back in the early 2000s, and we had 4 amps per side, and there were a lot of 6N1P tubes in there as the input tubes.
Okay.
And after about 3 months, the system would just sound flat. It just didn't sound right. And we finally figured out that we had to just religiously replace those things every 3 months, which is terrible. I mean, that's just not the way it should be. So something like our crack amp, you can probably get 10,000 hours out of the tubes pretty easily.
Yep. Right.
So call that 5 years. If you're running the amp 8 hours a day, a couple thousand hours a year, that's a 5-year lifetime on the tubes. Pretty good.
That's good. Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Cool. That's good. So this one's kind of linked to the last one. Many of these tubes, as I understand it, are no longer in production. They're all what we call new old stock. where it's stockpiles that have been found somewhere and someone's selling them off. So what happens down the track? Is there a foreseeable time where you can't get the tube?
Yeah, because people grab them all off of eBay and squirrel them away because they buy a crack amp. They decide they need to have 67, 60, 80 tubes in their closet.
No, not that many, but I've done it.
and then some other clown decides that the graphite plate Raytheons that I used to have like cases full of that people would bring to me and just dump in my basement are suddenly worth $175 a piece because one guy on the internet said they sound good.
Yeah.
It's a over the long term, it's a real issue. And I will say we're starting to see it with the crack amp. Really? 6080s were just used in every kind of, industrial application back in the old days for regulators in circuits. So there were bajillions of them around, and there's still tons of them around for the end user. It's really easy to find onesie twosies. In our position, where we have to find 100 to 300 to 500 at a time, it started to become an issue.
Okay.
We had a situation happen with our single-ended experimenters amp, which we first came out with in 1995. Probably about 5 years ago, we really started to feel that the 6DN7 tube that's used in that was getting tough to find in quantities. Mm-hmm. Again, it's still something that I think is probably easier for somebody to find on eBay. You can pick up a pair here and there for a reasonable price, but we just couldn't go out and find 100 of them when we needed them. So we found another tube that's basically the same tube in a different envelope, 6FJ7. It's got the same internal structure exactly. It's just in something called a 12-pin compactron, which is a really oddball thing that nobody uses.
Right, okay.
And so we bought them all. We bought every one we could find. And hopefully that'll last us for quite some time with this revision that the SEX 3.0 has the 6FJ7 tube in it. It sounds just the same. And we did that because it's an inexpensive tube that sounds great. We've done that a lot over the years. We try and find inexpensive tubes that sound really good to, again, for the end user, to make the kit reasonably priced in the first place and to make maintaining it over the years. And more importantly than maintaining it, to make tube rolling. Something that's an affordable hobby. I do caution people. I do think that there's this sort of range in tubes where it starts out as a screaming deal. You can pick these things up all day for a couple bucks, and then that might be when we design an amp, and then we come out with the amp, and then it's like, oh, I can get them for 10 or 15 bucks a piece, and it kind of stays there for a while. But then there's always some guy who says, I found this tube and I've never seen it anywhere else. So all I'm going to say is it's the greatest tube I have ever heard. You'll never be able to get one, but I just happen to have one more, and it's 225 bucks. At that point, I say, just turn around and run in the other direction as fast as you can and buy 10 more of those $15 tubes and have a lot more fun with it. It's really a point of diminishing returns on how much more quality there's in those tubes, in spite of what anybody says. And I'll fully admit that somebody will be able to go back and find some time where I've said something like that. I'm sure. I was probably one of the first guys with the crack amp that said, well, the 5998 tube is basically the same thing as a Western Electric 421A, which is the ultimate supposed tube in a crack. And I said, I think it was really great, but the one I got was $15, and now they're $150. So
yeah, that's it.
I don't know if it's still that great.
I remember being someone that bought, I must have had 3 or 4 different tubes that I'd rolled through the crack in the time that I had it. And they were all different. But again, it's sort of what you were saying before. It's a little bit like switching that impedance switch on the main line. Yep. Is it better or is it different? Is up to the individual, I think. So I think that's and then advice.
Unplug one set of headphones and plug another set of headphones in, and then suddenly it's a different tube.
So that's right.
It's the thing that keeps it interesting and also makes us crazy. So yeah, that's if we're still using an old stock tube, of which there is in the current version. We try to focus on things that are not really being used by other manufacturers, and that seem to be plentiful, so that people can get a hold of them and we can get a hold of them. That said, looking at this after being in the business for 25 years, that's not as easy as it used to be. And
Yeah.
I think you will see in the future that we will have a few more products coming out that are focused more towards current production tubes that are coming out of Eastern Europe and China, which we, of course, have actually been doing for a long time. The 2A3s we use and the 300Bs we use
Mm-hmm.
are both coming from New Sensor Corporation. We've been using their stuff for years. It's really consistent. It sounds great for the price and very reliable. We have very few problems with those tubes, and we've gone through a lot of tube manufacturers and transformer winders and all these different things over the years, and so that's a real consideration for us, that we want some. Not going to be a problem for the end user.
That's it for part 2 of the interview. I hope you're enjoying watching the interview as much as I enjoyed the conversation I had with Dan. There are 2 more parts at least still to come based on length and where it makes sense to chop up the topics. So do hit the subscribe button if you're enjoying this. Think about hitting the bell if you want to be notified when the next one drops. And I'll look forward to seeing you here next time on Passion for Sound.